Three, two, one. Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to Delusions of Grandeur. I am one of your hosts, but tonight I'm going to pass the torch off to my buddy Dane here, and he's going to tell us what's in store for us for our Audience Appreciation April-themed movie for our pre-show. So
that's right.
Take it away, Dane.
Well, tonight, these are both movies we'll talk about tonight. First in this pre-show were selected by you, the audience, and they both have something in common. They feature Tom Hanks as the lead, and one of them came out the very next year after the other film did. We're doing the later film first, the 1999 fantasy drama The Green Mile, based on the Stephen King novel of the same name, directed by Frank Darabont, starring our dear Tom Hanks, as well as Michael Clark Duncan in a star-making role, David Morse, Bonnie Hunt, Doug Hutchinson, James Cromwell, all manners of really, I think, dependable, great actors that don't get anywhere near the credit they deserve.
We should also note that not only Tom Hanks, but Barry Pepper stars in both of tonight's features.
He does, which is pretty cool. And then he later, 2000, he went on to do Battlefield Earth.
Brandon,
and he was never the same.
Brandon, who was the group that suggested this film for us? We should definitely give a shout out to that group.
I want to say it was Movie Collectors.
Movie Collectors, thank you very much.
I'm going to do a double check on that, but I'm pretty sure it's Movie Collectors.
Yeah, let us know. But yeah, so this is Frank Darabont, 5 years after having done another Stephen King prison adaptation with The Shawshank Redemption and gotten a lot of critical acclaim with that. We have we're walking the mile, walking the green mile, everybody. And basically, the plot synopsis is that Tom Hanks is a death row guard working alongside a lot of other death row guards in the Deep South in, I want to say, Louisiana.
Yes.
And
Louisiana.
then in comes this mysterious inmate named John Coffey. John Coffey, babe. Set like the Drake, but not spelled the same. I can't do the.
I don't think you can go that low.
No,
Michael Clark Duncan is like, dude.
Nobody can. Nobody can. Yeah, nobody can go that deep. I mean, he's like the polar opposite of me in terms of vocal range, and I'm very, very envious. But he comes along, and let's just say, mysterious miraculous things begin to take place when he's around. That's the short version. So let us go around the room and say what our first impressions of this film are. Let's start with Forrest.
Oh, wait, are you picking me because I have the same name as another Tom Hanks character?
Maybe not.
Run, Forrest, run!
Yeah, this is exactly why I went with Dragnet Tom Hanks instead of Forrest Gump for my avatar. But anyway, so actually, this is my first. I mean, I remember watching the last hour of this movie years ago, but this is my first time watching it this movie in its entirety. But I do remember, like, when I was watching that last hour, like it was with my mom and sister, and I remember both of them were crying because it was just that. Yeah, it was that heavy. But yeah, this is my first time watching it in its entirety, and I thought it was excellent. From the the cast was phenomenal, very strong performances, especially from Michael Clark Duncan. And of course, and Hanks, of course, you can always count on him to deliver. Right. But yeah, this one was really. I mean, it's very good. I would say, on one hand, it's very, touching, I guess. But very brutal. But I would agree. But while I was never in tears, but it's definitely the ending is like very crushing and brutal. is the word.
Mhm.
Because you really want, this is, he's a, he's a good guy. I mean, Coffee's a good, from right from the get go, there's something about Coffee that he is not a bad person, but was set up to be take the fall. It's just
A martyr.
He's a martyr.
Mhm.
A sacrificial lamb, if you will, which will be
Exactly.
very important as we get into themes.
Mhm.
Exactly. He's a sacrificial lamb, but and you love him. You want him to, like, I wish he was, like, I wanted him to be a free man, but it was, it seemed inevitable that it wouldn't happen. I mean, I never read the book.
Apparently, everything that was in the book pretty much ended up on the screen.
Yeah.
Mostly, yes. Mostly.
Yep. And also, of course, well, okay, even though I'm not much of a living in New York, I'm not too hot on rodents, but Mr. Jingles. Well, I guess maybe we'll save him for the character. I should say save Mr. Jingles for the character discussion. I was really taken away by it. First time watching it in its entirety, I was really taken away by it.
Mhm.
What about Brandon? What did you think of this film?
It's weird. I don't remember when I first saw this film. It was many years ago. It was on HBO at the time. I was still living with my parents at the time. Because I want to say, when did this come out? What was the year?
99.
Yeah, so I was off and on with my parents at the time. College kid.
Right.
But I remember seeing it in bits and pieces up until I purchased the DVD, which I still have that old snapper case DVD release of it. And I've had that in my collection for a while, probably since the early 2000s. And I had watched it fully for the first time, realizing the connection between it and Stephen King, because I remembered always associating him with horror, but I never thought about the other things, because I had known that Stand By Me was written by him, and I had known about The Running Man under that pseudonym, but I wasn't as familiar with Shawshank or Green Mile as written by him. So how he wrote some amazing dramas. And I was blown away by the characterization, as I usually am if a King film is done right, adaptation is done right, except for Trucks. Trucks was perfect. But lately I saw it again, and of course, I am conflicted on the film. I still feel it's a beautiful film. I feel some of the aspects are kind of dated as far as societal norms are concerned. I'm not going to go any farther than that. I'm going to be good, and I'm not going to bring up a lot of that controversy. Move on and just say that it doesn't necessarily hold up with societal norms. But even though I am conflicted over it, I still feel like it is a well done film, and I feel like the intentions that King had behind these types of characters, and there are lots of those coffee characters, basically, in his works. And not just
I
really.
just love that coffee characters. That's great.
Not meant necessarily in that way, because King likes to use a character that's been damaged either mentally or physically as kind of a spiritual guide or a totem, if you will. So that's a fairly common thing in his works. And he usually likes to use people of color in that as well. But again, I other than being slightly conflicted on it, I still consider the film quite well done, and not quite as bad as say Driving Miss Daisy would have been. Aging trope wise, similar trope, but definitely not done as well as it was here.
Yeah, well, that's the thing with any. I'll just say this: any trope of any kind, like it can be a trope, obviously, because it gets used over and over again. But like as with any trope or any cliche, it can be done well, and it can be done poorly, or it can just simply be overdone.
Right.
But at least for my money, yeah, you're right about those tropes you mentioned. I do think this is probably one of the better examples of it. But you're right, it is a trope.
Mhm.
And what about our dear David?
Well, I'm trying to think whether I actually saw this in the theater or not. I do know that I think that my grandma, when she was still alive, went and saw it with my mom, and then I actually bought the snap case and saw it for myself. And but I also remember reading the novel. And the thing is, I was one of those who would go to the store, buy the volumes before it came out in like a complete like set of and the thing is, the novel is more of a like an anthology.
It was a serialization.
And the thing you have to realize about the novel is that Shawshank came from the Green Mile. Because there was one of the volumes had to do with Shawshank and the story involved in that. So, at least that's
that's not really
what I
true,
remember.
though. That's not really
the novelization the collection that I have that's packaged like a novel does not include the Shawshank story, but it may have been published in the same manner. I do know they did not repackage them together.
Well, I know for a fact that
Rita Hayworth,
right,
and the Green Mile was mentioned in the novel, so there is.
Oh, it might have been mentioned.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
There is a
connection. World.
There is a connection that I remember. I didn't remember whether it was a full blown out story as part of the Green Mile, story. But I do remember that there was a connection of sorts, and
that part doesn't surprise me. Because Stephen King tends to reference himself, but Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption, that novella came first, and then, I haven't read either one, but you may be right that the novel of The Green Mile probably would reference something in Rita Hayworth and Shawshank Redemption.
Yep. So going from that into the film, I thought that this was a very good adaptation of the story put to screen. It was definitely long, and it was definitely an emotional film. And the thing is, each and every piece of this film was definitely put to you on a level of putting it at a period time, and I just love the story in general. I mean, it's a sad tale, and you're not expected to entirely have a happy ending. And I guess that's one of the things I like about it. And to me, this is actually one of the best novel to film adaptations to me of Stephen King's, next to like The Stand. So I was relatively entertained by it. I loved John Coffey as a character, and it was only recently that I heard about the magical creatures or characters of color. So,
the coffee characters, if you will.
Yes.
Which I kind of was hoping that
hard for me to put that idea of a trope to this film because I don't take it in that aspect. So I don't read that much into the trope. If you see what I'm saying.
I see it now that I'm older, but like when I saw it, it didn't ring true to me at the time, but also I'm not denying that it's there because I do think it is there, but I will say I think it is in there nowhere near as strongly as the kind of Christ narrative is, which that's another trope, but we'll get to that when we get to the story. What about Jake? What did you think of this film?
Well, this is one that for the life of me, I can't remember either the exact circumstances of my first seeing it. It did come out my freshman year in college when I was hanging out with a bunch of film geeks, and it did star Tom Hanks and have a Stephen King association. And I feel like I saw it in theaters. I know I saw it not long after. I really couldn't say for sure. But what I do know is that I immediately loved the film. I absolutely loved it. It was one of my favorite films of that year. And I've always loved it. I've always liked the movie. I've seen it a few times over the years, which unfortunately, as you guys, some of you saw our message thread earlier, I almost was prevented from having any significant refresher on this because some dumbass ran into a electric pole and knocked out power for 2 whole neighborhoods, and I was out of power for the first hour and a half that I was supposed to be watching the movie.
How coincidental though, because this too involves power being lost on multiple occasions.
So as it is,
like it was meant to be.
Well, as it is, I was able. Actually, I watched about 10 minutes before the power went out. I ended up watching up through the part where Wild Bill attacks Percy, which is a wonderful scene, and that was the part we had to put it on pause. I'm going to finish the movie tomorrow. Again, I've seen it a few times, enough to where I remembered it decently, and I think I'd actually read the book after the last time I'd seen it. I think I read the book about 2 or 3 years ago. So it's fairly fresh in my mind. Not fresh enough to catch every single reference King might have put into other stories, but enough that I can remember a couple things. One, this is a pretty faithful adaptation of the book, plot-wise and character-wise, and there are a few things that are changed. If I remember correctly, the execution order of the prisoners was changed a bit. And the book has more of what you might call a Stephen King vibe. Like, it's kind of creepy. And Paul Edgecombe is not nearly the heroic character that you usually expect from a Tom Hanks character. Edgecombe is much grayer in the book. But he's still a decent guy, basically. But a lot of the characters are straight out of the book. And it's a good adaptation, definitely. So that's worth noting, no doubt about it. It is a very well made film. I admit that parts of it feel a little less, did they need to do it that way, than when I first saw it? I admit. But that's seeing things through a different lens as you get older and wiser, But overall, I'd still say it's a good one. I also, we had shout outs already for Hanks and Duncan. I also really want to give a shout out right off the bat for Michael Jeter and David Morse. Both of them are just phenomenal for the movie. And it is a shame that both Jeter and Duncan have passed, since then. That is a shame. But
he was an excellent Kingpin.
Oh, yes, definitely. But what's that?
And Jeter, what a great character actor he was. Well, one of my favorite things about this film on the production standpoint is that outside of Hanks, who was obviously a household name at the time, outside of that, you had a lot of actors that just about everybody remembers visually, like they know their faces. but they're not really all that well known as far as their
Right.
name recognition, but they're just good, solid, dependable actors. And
Right.
there's a lot of them in this
Mhm.
movie that
Yeah.
and they're not particularly egotistical or whatever. They just go and do the job of playing the role, and
Mhm.
there's so many great ones in this film.
And actually, last night when we were doing our run up to the big award thing we want to do, we were talking about like bit role, cameo role, how that might be an award that should be given out. Graham Greene in this film is a great example of that. He only has a few scenes, and for most of the film, he doesn't really do much, but he has one short scene where he really gets to act, and he just nails it. But
He
it's
really
so
does.
short, you can you can forget it's even there because it's so short.
But you
But
remember him, you know?
exactly, yeah.
Well, that's really what
Mhm.
the acting caliber in this film, like, you
Mhm.
don't forget anybody that's in there. You may not remember their names, but you don't forget
Mhm.
them. They're very
Mhm.
memorable.
Mhm.
Well, I'll say for my first impressions, so I saw this movie when I was fairly young. I can't remember my exact age. I want to say I was like somewhere between 10 and 12, something like that. It was I might have had to have closed my eyes for some parts of it here and there. I wasn't like a little kid, but I wasn't like, middle school age yet necessarily either. I seem to remember this at having seen this at around the same time that I saw Castaway, and I saw Castaway like when it first came out on VHS, so that would have been like maybe early 2001. So
Yeah.
sometime around there. I can't remember exactly, but I wasn't like a little kid, but I wasn't really a teenager either. But I remembered loving it, absolutely loving everything about it, and I loved what a strong emotional impact it had on me. It did not make me cry, but because that was before I had ever cried at a movie. It took me quite a long time to finally find a movie that made me cry. But like it really got to me in a way, like on a deeper level than even just a tearjerker. Um, Again, there's very little of the film that I dislike. I love all the performances. I love the characterizations are so rich. The acting or the directing and the acting both very delicate and very you get the sense that this is a movie, and I've watched since this time. I've watched a lot of the special features, and apparently, what I'm about to say is backed up by how they felt about it. You really get the sense that in this film, that everybody involved in it really not only wanted to make a good movie, but they wanted to do it in the least kind of selfish way possible. Like you can tell that the actors are really giving to each other as to what they need to make the scene work. And, nobody's trying to like steal the show. Nobody's trying to crowd anybody out or whatever. And the only person that you could accuse of doing that is Hanks just because of his name recognition. But like, that's only because of that, not in terms of his performance. Like he's just as solidly doing the work as everyone else is. And I love that. I love the period piece nature of it. I love all the thematic depth. I love the blending of magical elements, supernatural elements with the overall realism. And I really love that the specter of death hangs over this movie in a pretty explicit way. Hangs over it from the very beginning, and it never leaves you. But it's such a great thing because you get to see kind of what death does to people. Like, does it make them better people? Does it make them worse? And you see both in this movie in pretty extreme ways. But I just think it has a lot to say about how we treat each other and how we treat those who are different from us, in not just in the racial aspect, but also in terms of like status and the free man versus the imprisoned man on death row, and how people are often seen as subhuman as a result of that. And so there's that, plus like it's a reframing of the Christ narrative, but kind of told through the perspective of the executioners and what that does to them, all that kind of stuff. I mean, there's very little I can say about this movie that's negative. That's how much it meant to me at the time. But so we got our first impressions there. So this is a movie that has a very involved plot. It's over 3 hours long. It would be impossible to sum it up scene by scene without us being here longer than the movie itself. But the characters really do drive this piece. And so Jacob mentioned Paul Edgecombe, who is our protagonist, played by Tom Hanks, who, and you do get the sense that he's playing somebody who, it could be because of the casting of Hanks, but like he is definitely characterized as somebody who is trying to, he really seems like he's the leader of this group of prison guards here on death row. You really get the sense, the sense, what?
I was going to say that he's the man in charge of these.
Yeah, well, he is kind of the Sheriff Woody of this group of people, but he's a much better person than Sheriff Woody at the beginning of this thing, because Sheriff Woody starts off as pretty dickish, in Toy Story.
He doesn't have laser envy like Woody.
Yeah, he doesn't. But what you really get the sense with this guy is that he is really trying to, despite where he works, despite his station in life, despite the station in life of those around him behind the bars, you really get the sense that he is trying to say, that we are going to conduct ourselves with dignity and with grace, and we're not going to be needlessly cruel. We're going to keep the peace. We're going to keep the order, but we're not going to be in any way, we're not going to treat our prisoners like they're any less than any of us. And so he has a remarkable amount of compassion, but also he knows the rules too. So he's not fooling himself into thinking that, these people are necessarily angels, but he also says, we don't have to stoop down to the level of someone like, say, Percy or Wild Bill, don't have to stoop down to that level. And so like whenever they have to do rehearsals for the executions, because this is 1935 and they're in the Deep South, they're doing electric chair executions, which they don't do anymore really. But despite all of that, they conduct rehearsals when the inmate for whom who they have on the chopping block next on the schedule, when they're otherwise out of their cell, and so they conduct the rehearsals at a time when they're not there. And so, you really get the sense that he's somebody who is trying to be a good man and try to hold on to his humanity in a place where the temptation towards despair would be ever present, always would be constantly there. What did we think about Paul as a character?
Well, the first thing about Paul that we get is that he's actually, not only is he in charge, but he has something wrong with his urinary tract.
Yeah.
We learn that he's got this like disease,
pretty bad infection.
A nasty infection. Yeah.
UTI is nothing to nothing to sneeze at. I can say that as a fact.
Well,
any infection.
This movie was actually the first time I'd ever heard of a urinary tract infection before.
Right.
That's a good thing. You don't want to
it's
hear
not
it
something
the way
you
you normally do.
It's not something you commonly see depicted.
No.
The thing is, we get the beginning of this film as old Paul is in a nursing home, and he's beginning to tell this tale of his of why he is who he is to this other elderly woman, and we get the first experience of this first day where he's pissing razors.
Well,
there's a little bit more.
If you're going to mention that first scene, there's a couple. One, you find out he sneaks off somewhere every day, but also you get to see his reaction to seeing Top Hat, which is a movie I have sitting on the shelf and needs to be watched. But It is a really interesting moment, and that's what sets the whole storytelling part of it. The what do we say? Flashback. There we go.
Well,
The most of the movie is a flashback.
It's a couple.
Yeah.
Well, it's a couple. It's even more than that because
Right.
you got he wanders off. You got that he cries at Top Hat. But even before that, you saw they were watching all these old timers who have no real
Right.
business watching or interest in watching Jerry Springer, who for some reason
Right.
are. But it also kind of shows just how much society has changed,
Right.
and in some ways better, in some ways not so much. But then they flip on Top Hat, and that's something that he had a real memory of having seen when it was new. And so it's that plus the association with the film that we will later learn it runs a lot deeper than that, and that begins that flashback where he's not in the greatest health in terms of his urinary tract, and they got a new prisoner, which is John Coffey,
And you can tell that he is a heavy person because when he steps off of that truck, that truck, it bounces several times.
It's like
after he gets up.
It's like the David Morse's character, Brutal. He's looking. He's like, they must have busted a spring on that. Something.
Yeah, which I was shocked. I was shocked to learn because for some reason I thought Michael Clark Duncan was a football player for years and then became an actor. I was surprised to learn that no, he tried a little bit of like small time basketball for a while because he was so tall. And mostly was like a bouncer and a bodyguard, and then really tried to be an actor. And then, his first big break just in a big movie was Armageddon the year before. But his first big break, like as a dramatic actor, and to show that he really had the right stuff for it, was this film. I thought he was a football player because he has the physique for it, totally. But I guess not.
He also participated in Disco Demolition Night at a White Sox game back in the late 70s.
Which is pretty cool. He gets off the truck and he's significantly bigger than everybody else around him, and he's the only black guy with whom they interact for the most part. But he is. Seemingly they call him kind of slow-minded, but again, it's kind of there's a whole separate trope, which actually Tom Hanks himself had explored in Forrest Gump, the idea of the quote-unquote slow-minded person who is actually much more of a genius and a sage than the normal people around him, which is kind of its own trope.
Sort of the idiot savant sort of thing.
Kind of,
Idiot savant.
Yeah.
Oh, Simple Jack.
You don't go full
Retard.
But anyways,
to do that one day.
Paul to me is like the centerpiece of of kind of the film, besides John Coffey's character, because I don't feel like he's a protagonist. I feel like Percy is a protagonist, but
he's the antagonist.
Yeah, he's one of the antagonists. Which now imagine Percy as the protagonist. That would be a whole different movie.
Oh.
That would be a whole different.
Yeah,
that
it's
actually
hard
be
to
kind
think
of a
of
cool.
somebody actually rooting for Percy as like their favorite at that age.
I'll say this: Percy is one of my favorite characters because he's one of the best, characters that you love to hate. He's one of the best of those. He's one of the best of those kind of characters, and played beautifully.
And if I'm remembering correctly, Doug Hutchison, who plays him, one of his notable previous role to this, if I'm remembering correctly, was he was one of the two boys on trial in A Time to Kill for what they did to that little girl. So I definitely know of him as someone that plays unsavory characters. And
I knew him as the guy who was what was Eugene Victor Toombs on 2 episodes of the X-Files where he could stretch his body. And it's funny because he was also on Lost too. I forgot about that. Two shows that I loved to death. But I remembered him as a kid. I remembered him from the X-Files, and I remembered he was so creepy in that show. And he apparently, because he had to be like nude in the script, but he just decided, oh, I'm gonna just walk around the set naked, and so he did that for the X-Files. So he definitely lays it all out there, to quite literally to do his roles. But yeah, well, as they bring in John Coffey, he's the one who's like, dead man, we got a dead man walking here. And so that sets him up immediately as another, well, a trope in general, but one that's very specific to Stephen King stories, which is the bully character, or the bully / sadist, who has some kind of homicidal bent. Which that's in like pretty much every Stephen King thing, and he's one of the best of those, largely because of how well he's portrayed. He is one of the best love to hate him characters, and Tom Hanks tries to maintain the peace and maintain the order, and it just so happens that he's a privileged kid who's like the nephew of the governor, and so he can't be gotten rid of easily. So there's quite a lot of a power struggle between the two of them for most of the film. But, we establish in some of those early scenes who Paul is. We establish his compatriots on the mile. It's called the Green Mile because of the linoleum flooring that has a green color. And the other guys that he's surrounded by, they seem to have really taken after his example because they're very decent guys. Like they sure try to be decent guys who, they follow his example and they follow his leadership pretty readily. But you get the sense that they're all trying to be better than what their station in life would dictate.
Right. Like basically his right hand is the one that's played by David Morse. Brutal is his nickname, but he's really not, Brutus Howell. This is kind of hilarious actually. Jeffrey DeMunn, Frank Darabont regular, plays Harry Terwilliger, and Barry Pepper plays Dean Stanton, and Harry Dean Stanton plays the Toot Toot, the guy that
the guinea pig.
But I just thought that was kind of hilarious. I wonder if they hired him on purpose because of that, or if that was just a weird coincidence.
Could have been an homage to him. You don't know.
Could be. But
we get a lot. We get a lot of eccentric characters like that in the piece. Because like now for the longest time, I thought this was something I found out on this viewing. I thought Toot Toot was another prisoner that they just, used a lot. But I guess not. He's just a guy who's in the prison, like selling snacks to the guards and to the.
I also think that he's kind of a janitor of sorts.
Yeah, I think he is. Yeah. And I think they explained it more in the book exactly what his role was, but he is basically the janitor and all around gopher, I guess you could say. If they need
clown-ish kind of character.
If they need something done.
Hippity hop all the way to Old Sparky.
He's one of my favorite characters just because, again, memorable. But we meet all these eccentric characters and all these different power dynamics, and we get an idea of what John Coffey, who seems to be about as gentle could be, despite being as big could be. You get the sense that, why is this guy behind bars? Well, he's accused of having raped and killed 2 little girls. And, we're going to find out exactly how true that is. But that's what he's accused of. And so that kind of plants the seed in Paul's head of how on earth could this guy have done this? and that contrasts pretty heavily with another character who will arrive on the scene who really does deserve to be there, who's Wild Bill, who until this viewing, I had never put two and two together that was Sam Rockwell, because I didn't know who Sam Rockwell was for a long time, and then now I do. But I didn't put two and two together. Then seeing it now, I'm like, oh, this is a great role for him. He's a pretty chameleonic actor, but he does a especially good job in this because he is a wild man, and he's actually kind of a Cletus Cassidy / Carnage type, for those of us that know Spider-Man. But he's very similar as far as like someone that's certifiably nuts and violent and sadistic and all that stuff in a way that's a bit more, as sadistic and evil as he is at least a bit more. He is at least a bit more honest about his depravity in a way that Percy is not, because Percy happens to have the veneer of a respectable person who has good connections. He just also is a weasel and a coward, but he's someone who comes on the scene a little bit later, and he, as we will later find out, that it was in fact Wild Bill who raped and murdered those girls, not John Coffey.
Spoilers.
Besides those two characters, we get a sort of half Indian character, which
Arlen Bitterbutt.
Played by Graham Greene, where apparently his is the first death row inmate that we
executed,
getting prepared for old Sparky.
Right. Which, Dave, if you remember the book, and you can maybe remember, I feel like they switched Bitterbuck and Delacroix. I feel like in the book, Delacroix was the first that died. I could be remembering that wrong, but I think they did.
I think so. So that is a bit of a change.
A slight change,
but really, altogether, I think it plays out better.
Because Delacroix is such a likable character. I think they probably decided that they wanted to do more with him in the movie and just kind of keep him around longer. Plus, that means Mr. Jingles got to be a star.
So. Oh yeah, which we forgot to get to the best character in the piece, who is Mr. Jingles, who is a mouse, very cute, very Cycus mouse. Very cute, very lovable mouse who, honestly, he is my favorite character because, well, we have a lot of kind of extraordinary things in this story and extraordinary people in it, but, or certainly standout people. Mr. Jingles, he's a mouse who arises just out of the walls one day, and seemingly, there's not a whole lot to him, or so people think. And they cannot, capture him. They can't find out where he's hiding. And it turns
they know where he's hiding. It's in the restraint room.
Well, but they can't find like a hole. They can't. Yeah, they can't find a hole in the wall or anything. Right. Is what I'm saying. They know generally where he comes from.
You get that lovely pair of scenes. First of all, you get I think it's like Paul and Brutal and all the guys we like go in there, clean out the restraint room. They can't find the mouse. And you're sitting there going, how did they even fit all that crap in that room in the first place? But they put it back in, and then Percy sees the mouse and goes off half-cocked and just tears the room apart. And Paul lets him do it. And then finally, once he's got everything off his chest, he just looks right at him and he says, get that shit back in that room.
Not to mention, Percy is very antagonistic toward Edward Delacroix.
Oh, yeah.
He's antagonistic towards everybody, but particularly against Edward Delacroix, and even more particularly against Mr. Jingles, which is one of the things that I think honestly what I love about Mr. Jingles, besides that he's so damn cute and talented as a mouse. And I say talented because what they find out is that he is a lot smarter than he looks. He can play fetch. He can roll the little thread wheel and that kind of stuff. He can do all kinds of things. And I think what he symbolizes a lot of important things about the script, about this story, which is that, he's small and seemingly insignificant, and yet he's capable of extraordinary things. He might be easy to miss at first, and yet he's there, and he, shows just what he's made of. He's another kind of extraordinary element that is in the guise of something ordinary or something that you think you understand completely. And plus, he's an innocent force, even more so than even John Coffey. But he's an innocent because John Coffey knows the ways of the world all too well, and that's why he chooses what he chooses at the end. But Mr. Jingles is an innocent force who he brings out the best and the worst in everyone, which is why you see like Edouard Delacroix and John Coffey, they care for him, and the other ones are sort of morbidly curious about him, and then they come to care for him too in their own way. And then someone like Percy like keeps trying to kill it, just because it's small. So he really brings out what's inside of everyone, which I think a lot of animals do.
And eventually, Percy does stomp the shit out of Mr. Jangles, which
he does indeed.
Which does put the first instance where we see what John Coffey is capable of.
Not the first, but it's more significant than clearing up bladder and urinary tract
infection. Bladder infection was after that.
No, that was first.
Oh, okay.
Well, so what happens is that because there's a lot of little back and forth incidents like that. It is a Stephen King story, so there are a lot of elements that are kind of slow.
Character building.
Yeah, it's a lot of slow
about. It's all character.
A lot of slow burn aspects of it, but they all it's how they fit together that really is the magic of the movie, I think. And because the supernatural elements are not introduced right away, they are gradually introduced and kind of in small pieces.
Wasn't it the same day that John Coffey was brought in or whatnot, that Wild Bill Hickok was brought in? Or was it
No, that was a few days later.
2 days later?
It was days later, but what was soon after that was the arrival of Mr. Jingles. That was fairly soon after. And I do think that the arrival of certain people and creatures, their arrivals are pretty deliberate because, again, you see how they play off each other and what they bring out in each other. But, some of the first incidents of the supernatural don't come until with Wild Bill there, him having tried to escape and fight off the guards and stuff while pretending to be mentally incapacitated. I thought, well, they said, we thought he was doped, which I kind of wondered if they meant like really on drugs, like sedated, or if they meant like he might have had a lobotomy or something. But,
really
well, but point being, like, he gets to the prison and he tries to fight him off, and he whacks old Paul Edgecombe, Tom Hanks, right in the nuts and exacerbates his already horrific urinary tract infection, and that's where John Coffey is able to take the infection away, and thus we find out John Coffey has the power to heal people. And I really love the way I got to talk to you. Yeah, I got to talk to you. And what I love about that, the way that it's done, see, each act of healing does get bigger and bigger and more spectacular. But what I love about the actual sickness that he takes away from people, I love the way that it's represented, because He touches, does the classical laying on of hands and takes it away, but then he coughs up these things that look a bit like spores crossed with flies, which I thought was really cool.
More
And they
like
kind of fade
fireflies.
away once he coughs them out. They all fade away, and I just love the way that sickness is depicted, in a kind of physical but also metaphorical way. And that's when Tom Hanks is like, "What did you just do to me?" And gradually they introduce more of exactly what John Coffey is able to do, just how much he can heal and that sort of thing. It goes from urinary tract infection to bringing a squashed mouse back to life. Admittedly, soon after he gets squashed, because like he says, there might be still time, because he tried to take it back with the girls, but it was too late. And
I took it back.
Yeah, that's right. And so you gradually get an increase in the power that he displays. And usually at around that time, that's kind of when you get these various characterization aspects that reach ahead, as far as like you see Tom Hanks's Paul Edgecomb's his urinary tract infection got worse and then it went away. Meanwhile, you had Billy, was his name Billy, but he gets executed. But before he gets executed, he has that beautiful speech, which again, that makes his character very memorable. The idea of when a man dies, is basically it's kind of a reconceptualization of the idea of heaven, that when someone dies, that they go back to the moment when they were the happiest. And that whole thing I thought was just beautifully written. But his execution is meant to demonstrate what an execution done according to protocol, what that's supposed to look like and how it's supposed to function. And so that way, when Edouard Delacroix, when his execution goes so horribly wrong, that way you can see exactly what constitutes a good version of an execution of this nature.
It's supposed to be wet.
So
you were going to say something,
point
Brandon?
out one thing. Yeah, I wanted to, before my cat kicked me off of the conversation, I wanted to point out something that is important plot-wise when it comes to a well done version of a Stephen King novelization. Because to me, that's one of the things that does speak for this film, is it does feel like an actual Stephen King novel. Because the Stephen King novel does start slow, and it builds character through these kind of what the events themselves seem harmless, and in many cases you think to yourself, this is just taking runtime out of the movie, but it's not, because by the time you even get to the first execution, you actually feel something, and then when you get to the execution of Delacroix, you actually do feel something. And that's something they're not unique to King. It is something that he does very well, to where by the end you really do feel like you know these characters because of these little things.
Right.
They're taking Percy there and making him take all the stuff out of the room. Them doing the thing with looking for Mr. Jingle, just little bonding elements that they have together. The picnic with the guy's wife who is going demented with the cancer, which we'll get to later. It's defining moments which do make you care for the characters, and it really.
Well, even again to again come back to Bitterbug as an example, that little story he tells about his happiest time is the only thing he says in the movie, but it tells you so much about the character, and yeah, that is one of the hallmark of King's books, is the that even little characters get a lot of he does a lot with a little, I think, which when you look at his books, they're not little, but you know what I mean, like
it's the ways in which these characters, the ways in which these seemingly small things, the way in which they all fit together to create the whole. It's a tapestry, and I think they described it as such in the behind the scenes, that his writing is very much that way. Well, the other thing you find out in that exchange, and something that will be a running theme throughout not just this story, but a lot of Stephen King stories, is kind of a quest for the realm of the spiritual, but also a reconception of what that even means. Because, with that speech, that is it Bitterbuck? For some reason, I said Billy Buck. Bitterbuck, when he says that that's kind of his what if conception of heaven, that it's in the line of what we in the Western world kind of typically associate with heaven. It's in the ballpark, but it's not really exact, in the same way that with John Coffey, with his ability to heal and stuff, he's obviously put into the Christ figure role, and especially being falsely accused and being sentenced to death and blah blah blah. But he also he is able to make judgment calls based on like he's not just a purely merciful figure, kind of in the same way. I guess this is more of a parallel, but much like Jesus and everything, he's not like a purely merciful figure. He also can dispense punishment when he feels is appropriate. And he wants to die because of the pain that he feels in the world every day. So again, it touches a lot of those same ballpark elements of what we've kind of generally in this part of the world, what we've come to associate with those ideas, but it's kind of bringing it down to earth a bit more, but it's also in a way that is outside of the expected package.
See, I wouldn't put it in the Jesus Christ category. I would want to put it in the category of Barabbas if I were thinking of a religious story.
Well, that would be no, that would be some of the people that he's surrounded by, because that was the whole idea of Barabbas, is that he is an actual bad guy who gets let go. Meanwhile, the sacrificial lamb has to die. But and actually, it's in his initials, John Coffey, JC, which is obviously very deliberate.
Well, yeah, although I did read that King apparently named him specifically for someone named John Coffey, but he probably did have it. He probably did have it in his mind that, oh, well, look at those initials.
Well, how can you not?
It's odd about his religious additions, especially considering his own religious beliefs, that he tends to throw a lot of Christian iconography in his works. And The Stand is also another one a lot like that at the end.
And apparently, again, I watched the behind the scenes. Apparently, it is a running theme throughout a lot of Stephen King's work, but again, it's more of like a quest to kind of find or rediscover these ideas outside of their expected packages, as opposed to like more of like a traditionalist take on these things. Which I think is what makes them kind of cool and different. By putting this kind of Christ figure in the form of this black man in the Deep South at a time, when they're heavily marginalized, pre-civil rights, Jim Crow in great effect, throughout the South. He's put in the position of being marginalized on that front, and kind of in the same way that the Jews in occupied Roman occupied Judea, kind of a religious and ethnic marginalized group, so it's there's some similar parallels there. But what's interesting, I think, about the way that this thing progresses, and we have to really take like a very unfortunately surface level glance at all these great incidents and moments, because there's so many, but the way in which they all fit together do weave that tapestry of how does a human being, how does he or she react to someone or something that is miraculous meaning the impossible made possible. And that's what and actually on a small level, like I said, Mr. Jingles is pretty extraordinary just on a small level, because mice are not normally that intelligent. But he brings out the best and worst in people, and then you magnify it many times over with the slow reveal of who and what John Coffey is and what he can do, and the fact that he is able to dispense both justice and mercy in spectacular fashion. And it's what does that do for everyone that sees that? What kind of reaction would that bring about in a person? And
Well, like one of my favorite reactions in the whole film is there's a few really good ones, but like I really like when they first bring Coffee in and they're putting him in his cell, and Edgecombe goes into the cell with him, and he's giving him the basic interview. Like he's looking at his clipboard. He's not even really paying all that much attention to him personally. But he's like, "So do you have any questions?" or something to that effect. And he's like, "Yes, sir. Do you leave the lights on at night?"
Yeah, because he's afraid of the dark.
And then just the way Edgecombe just looks at him, and just like, he could not believe that was the question. And he's like, "Well, yeah, it stays pretty bright around here."
Well,
yeah.
and
Which I when I was a kid, I really sympathized with John Coffey in that moment, because I also was not. I had a nightlight on for a good long time when I was growing up, because I also was kind of afraid of the dark.
Right, but this like they're all looking at this dude like he's this huge, monstrous guy who could easily end any one of them at a moment, and Edgecome's pretty chill, but the others are all kind of like on edge. And then he asks that question, and they're all like, "Where'd this come from?"
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, but again, it's the unexpectedness of the extraordinary, in an unexpected package.
Right.
And Dave was trying to say something.
Okay.
I was trying to say that very early on, for these gentlemen of this establishment of death, that they seem to over time show some empathy towards John Coffey as a character, because the more that he's around them and the more that he does, the more things that he's able to perform. Ultimately, it kind of imbues them to him as a character, and I really feel like each one of them, like as characters who are these like prisoners who probably see death like all the time, especially in this day and age. The fact that this one person can show them this amount of emotion and produce this kind of energy, it was something to behold.
Without a doubt. Well, and I think it's important to know. Well, I think what's so important about these guys in particular, in comparison to a lot of the people that are around them, because they had no real incentive to be as good a guys as they were. They could very easily have sunk down to the depths of sadism in the way that Percy does, or to the degrees of like explicit, Jim Crow racism of the period and of the place, or even on a more passive level, like the one scene that Gary Sinise is in.
Yeah.
Tragically, the one scene, but a very good
that
scene.
little speech he gives is like he's delivering it in just this perfectly matter of fact, like it's just the most obvious thing in the world. And you're listening to what he's saying and saying, "Oh my God, those are some dated views."
Well, he argued, because he was his defense attorney, his public defender, basically.
Yeah.
And clearly his heart's not in it, obviously. And you get the sense that he's really not trying to be like a bad person or anything. He's doing his job, and he doesn't outright despise. He doesn't outright despise John Coffey, but he also is very much entrenched in his time and place. So he basically thinks that black people are like dogs as far as like being simple minded and, like just, they respond to love and affection or whatever. And then all of a sudden, they might snap one day like a dog did for his son who, basically bit one of his eyes out and that kind of stuff.
His mind one day and
yeah. And, it's one of those things where, like, again, he's very, like you said, very matter of fact about it. He's not, particularly malicious about it. And yet, he is just as much of a cog in that malicious machine as somebody that would be an out and out, explicit, racist, like, say, Wild Bill, who has no problems letting the N-word fly. And that's I think a pretty important thing that somebody like Gary Sinise's character, who is really not trying to be any one way or the other, he just is a cog in that particularly malicious machine of that time and place.
And keep in mind, they still do have one thing that he makes sure to let him know, which was, yes, these things. Yes, I don't really feel like he is there, but when he asks, well, why did you defend him? It's like, well, every man deserves a defense.
Yeah, exactly.
And he still believed that, despite what his personal prejudices were, he still believed the defense.
Exactly. Well, and you see, that's what I mean. Like, you see a lot of degrees of human behavior. You see the extremes, and then you also see the people who are more in the middle on various parts of that spectrum. And so you get a pretty wide gamut of like people that can be humane and can be decent to someone that is heavily marginalized in this time and place. And then you get people that are they're not really modern in any kind of way, but they're also not explicitly awful per se. And then you get someone who is explicitly awful, up to and including raping and killing 2 girls, or being a weaselly sadist who's very much a product of this malicious system. So you get it all in this movie, and they present all of those kinds of characters very well. A lot of dimension to them.
Another backstory that we get is that of Hal Morris, played by James Cromwell.
Right.
Yes.
Another great character.
One of my favorite actors who, again, not like a superstar, but like in terms of name recognition, but like you remember that dude's face, and he does the job, does the work, does it extremely well each time.
And apparently his character is like a very good friend of Paul Edgecombe's. Apparently they have hung out before in the past. And the reason why they haven't is because Mr. Mora's his wife has actually ended up with some kind of a cancer in her brain.
A brain tumor that's inoperable.
Yep. So we get that kind of story, and eventually that's kind of where our John Coffey character ends up being like the savior of that situation.
He does. Well, and what's so interesting about that whole thing is because by that point in the story, we're getting ahead of ourselves because we still need to cover the fact that Percy, the whole deal they have with him is that he he wants to see one fry up close, and but the deal is, okay, we'll let you do one of the executions, and then you sign that transfer to work at the mental hospital, and then you're off the block. That's it. No harm, no foul. And for a while there, which this is one of my favorite things about the story, for a while there, it looks like Percy is starting to make some positive changes. It looks like he's, showing some kind of compassion. It looks like he's following the rules. He's observing everything. He knows proper protocol, etc. And then he just backtracks and shows off his true colors, and including not wetting the sponge and setting Edouard Delacroix's head on fire, pretty much.
Well, after stomping Mr. Jingles.
Yeah, stopping Mr. Jingles too. But like he sets the guy's head on fire by not wetting the sponge. And it's like I forgot just what a horrific death it really is.
James Cromwell's character comes down into that. Apparently, they have an area where they had the body after they cooked him, and he's like, "What the hell happened there?" Well, we had an execution, a successful one.
Yeah.
How could you call that a success?
Well, you know what's funny about all of that? Well, a couple things. One, even in the successful execution with Bitterbook, even with that, they had to zap him a few times. If you remember, it just wasn't quite as horrific as that. But they did have to zap him a few times because he was still breathing after the first zap. And so, that was how things are quote unquote supposed to go. But even then, it's not necessarily a simple like zap and that's it. They had to go at it a few times. But then with Edouard Delacroix having suffered so horrifically, it's like, he is just as dead. But then he's like, that smell won't come out for like 5 years or however long. And but Paul Edgecombe, he has enough sense about him to know that he has to kind of cover for Percy just so that way he'll fulfill his end. He's having to make that sacrifice because otherwise he'll be stuck with Percy forever.
Right.
They'll have even more fuck ups like that happen.
I think, but also Percy represents a state of mind.
Yeah.
That is a dual-minded system of how our incarceration system is to work. There is a portion of the population, and a lot of our society here in the United States looks at prison time as retribution and full-on punishment. Whereas there are some that look at this sort of as a way of trying to reform those that can reform, while retaining that of our humanity. I think that it's really a state of two minds. I really think that Percy is in the mind of many states' way of doing things.
He is. But he's also the mindset of not just systems, but also individuals who, beyond just wanting punishment in the way that, like, when John Coffey finally is set to be executed, the way that those people really want blood in the very draconian sense, which is a bit more what you typically see from most people. And there are a lot more draconian minded people that exist in this world than I would like. But they are nonetheless common. But somebody like Percy, he's a sadist in the true sense of the word. He would be a very good student of the Marquis de Sade, from whom the word sadism derives. Sadism meaning that they take pleasure in the pain of others, and it's not in the typical retribution kind of sense. It's for its own sake. And, so he really does want to see suffering. And particularly
our society as a whole likes suffering, as you believe.
They do, we do, but I think it tends to. I'd say if you ask most people, they would at least outwardly, they would probably state that it comes from.
Most people would, at least if you were trying to engage them in conversation, at least if they were not necessarily in their behind closed doors talking to their friends or whatever, they'd be close to. There's that one scene after Bitterbuck has died, and Percy is like mocking his corpse, like slapping him around a bit, and then Brutal comes up and grabs his hand, and he's like, "Hey, he's paid his debt. He is square with the house. Leave your hands off of him," And I would think that's probably most people would be like, "Yes, he had a debt to pay. He paid it. Move on," But Percy definitely fits the mindset of the people that are like, well, I think he says, like, "We'll see you in hell," or something like that.
That's right.
Well, most of the cancel culture of today can be looked at that as there is no forgiveness.
Not just that, but also just like, I think most people that, especially like those who are for the death penalty, I think that they tend to be in the mindset more so of like the draconian sense of like or the Old Testament idea of like an eye for an eye and the punishment fits the crime and that kind of stuff versus because when I say sadism, I mean like pleasure from other people's suffering kind of for its own sake, not for the sake of revenge, not for the sake of that kind of stuff. I think most people tend to be in the mindset of those people who witnessed John Coffey's execution, because true sadists are generally a smaller crowd than that, but they definitely exist, and they can exert really disturbing levels of cruelty and unfortunately authority, because they will often be attracted to positions where they can exercise those sadistic drives, you know.
And now, unfortunately for Percy, he is a pure sadist and not a sadomasochist, because when he meets another sadist in Wild Bill, it ends in him being utterly humiliated. Whereas if he was a sadomasochist, he might have enjoyed it. But it was but again, you know, probably the single most sadistic thing he probably did in the whole movie, arguably, other than the botched execution. That was, but one could argue him stomping Jingles was even worse, because he not only was murdering Jingles, but he also was doing it specifically to crush Delacroix's soul, basically.
Well, and he did, and what's sad is that even after they do the whole thing of like they bring him back to life, and they try to frame it as you're no better at killing mice than you are at, you know, X, Y, and Z. Which
I love their reaction to that. I'm looking here at one of the quotes where Percy's whining and like, you switched them somehow, you bastards. And Boodle's like, yeah, I always keep a spare mouse in my wallet for kids.
I love that scene. I love that. But like, but then, you know, so they use that as a way to humiliate him again.
Right.
But then, you know, he just couldn't let it go, and he has to tell Delacroix, you know, right before he fries him in a horrific way, that there is no such thing as Mouseville, and it's just a fairy tale. They told you to keep you quiet. Just thought you ought to know. And it's like, you fucking bastard. Again, beautifully played by Doug Hutchinson. You just love to hate this guy.
And again, that's one of the reasons why probably my favorite line in the whole movie that I've always loved is when he gets his comeuppance, when Coffee basically puts that tumor into his brain.
Yeah.
And he goes catatonic, and you got that dude. I think this boy's cheese is done slid off his cracker.
and he ends up in the mental hospital where he was going to work, but he ends up as a patient.
I love that. That's one of my favorite colloquialisms I think I've ever picked up.
I know. That's like a Coen Brothers line right there.
Yeah. What are you looking at, you limp noodle?
Yeah.
I love lip noodle as another colloquialism. But the you know, but his whole arc there, it's perfect poetic justice there, because you know, well, and to tie it back into the brain tumor thing, because the brain tumor in James Cromwell's wife's brain, as unfortunately happens with a lot of people with those kinds of brain tumors, it does alter their personalities, and it makes her kind of out of it for a lot of the time, and then at her bad day, she is up all night screaming and wailing, and then like cursing and like, you know, Linda Blair exorcist type language. And you know, our heroes do something that is pretty damn risky. They bust John Coffey out of prison enough to have him heal her, and but it works. And now, granted, the size of the job, shall we say, of the tumor, the sickness, the whatever, the evil or the malady inside of her, you might say, the size of it is so great that it takes him a while to cough it all back out again.
Right.
And one of my favorite bits is like you see the contrast in her behavior. Yeah, she's like, yeah, pig fucker. You know, she's like saying stuff like that. and then the tumor's gone, and she's like kind of angelic in a way. But she says another sort of small throwaway thing that is actually pretty significant, which is that she's like, I dreamed about you, and that we were lost in the dark together, and that whole thing. I thought that was another small thing, but also is pretty damn significant, because it's the idea that there are realms of the spiritual that not only are beyond their understanding, but they are kind of sort of in the ballpark of what they know, but not really. There's still enough mystery about them. And
speaking,
go ahead.
well, speaking of that sequence where they go, take coffee to see her. I mean, you think about that. You've got the guy in charge of death row and his right-hand man. And it doesn't matter if the warden is an old friend of his. This is Depression era Louisiana, and they're breaking a black man accused of double homicide and rape of young girls out of prison.
Blonde-haired white girls.
They're taking this man out of prison, off death row, to directly to the warden's wife. And it's like, if it had turned out any other way, not only would they have lost their jobs, he might have killed them on the spot just for what. And that's and just I just want to throw out a thought that as far as the whole idea that this may have been just another example of the mystical Negro or whatever. King has claimed that he made coffee black solely because that was the way the story worked. And if you look at this scene, the stakes are that much higher because he is.
I think he's absolutely right. He's absolutely right on that front, but I think also then you frame it in the Christ figure kind of allegory there that I threw out there, because Jesus is a member of a religiously and ethnically marginalized group in Roman occupied Judea. So then you've got that going for it as well, and plus, but it's just in a context that we in the late 20th, early 21st century that we understand better. In terms of more firsthand experience. But you're right, the stakes are higher, but also that's why kudos to the writing. The fact that we had established the kind of relationship that he and Paul and the rest of the guards that they had with each other prior to that moment. We took our time to where we really buy that he would even allow the slightest chance of such a thing to even remotely come to pass, because if that homework, if that had not been done, there's no chance in hell that would have happened. But
like if we're looking at Bob Gunton, the warden from Shawshank, I could see that would have gone very differently.
Or any other character that we hadn't gotten to know so well, like we wouldn't have bought it in the way that we do here.
Well, that's the thing is we do know the character as well,
and same with when we come back from the prison and John Coffey does finally expel the sickness, the malady, the evil from his body. He does so this is where you get kind of we'd seen the healing, we'd seen the kind of more warm and fuzzy side of the Christ figure. We'd seen that already. Then we see the justice, the just punishment, the that side of it, which is also a part of the Christ figure, part of that whole conception. It's part of that. It's just not as shown off quite as readily as we think that it is typically. But he exacts punishment upon Percy, who then exacts punishment upon Wild Bill, who was the real killer and rapist of those girls. And so he, again, just like God giveth and God taketh away, same thing there. He is able to use his gift to punish the wicked. And so it's not all warm and fuzzy. And I think that's pretty necessary in the overall construction of not just the Christ figure allegory there, but just of John Coffey's character. He, despite supposedly being simple-minded, which again I put that in big quotation marks because I think
Right.
he's by far and away the most wise character and the most intelligent character there. But he, he knows enough to not let evil persist. He gives it its just due, and does so in the most kind of poetically just fashion, because it's Percy who exacts this kind of frontier justice, you might have said, upon Wild Bill, and then he, expels the malady from his body, but by that time his brain is just fried, and he ends up being in the mental hospital where he would have worked, but he's there as a patient instead. So, you do get a sense of some degrees of poetic justice, but then the great injustice is the idea that this miraculous healer, that he's still condemned to die.
Right.
The key difference in our Christ figured allegory here, the key difference is that Jesus dies for the sake of redeeming the sins of the world, and John Coffey, who is plagued by the sins of the world in a kind of similar metaphorical way, is plagued by the sins of the world because he feels he's also kind of a literal empath, because he feel Edouard Delacroix when he's getting executed and he's frying, he can feel it. And so can
But
Mr.
he also senses the evil of Wild Bill before he even enters the death row.
That's
like
right.
he tells Edgecombe, "Careful, boss."
Yeah,
he knows
right.
this guy is
Well, but with all that being said, it's like he feels it's not quite up to Jesus levels, but it's like
Right.
he feels the horrors of this world, and it pains his heart, and he wants to be released from it. So it's more so of a sense of not wanting to bear that burden anymore, as opposed to making the ultimate sacrifice for the sins of the world, etc. But it is a release from the realm of the physical and all of its slings and arrows and all that stuff. It hits the necessary beats. It's just, I think that's a very important difference there. So, but he still meets that fate of being unjustly condemned to death, but for a higher purpose. So
And actually, if there is a quote that from Edgecombe during this basic part of the film, if I remember, again, I didn't get that far on this viewing. I can't remember if I think he was talking to his wife like before the execution, if I'm remembering correctly. Right, but like there's a line where Edgecombe says, "I've done some things in my life I'm not proud of, but this is the first time I've ever felt in real danger of hell."
That's right.
And if you want to look at your Christ narrative, you could put that at as some of the things that Pilate said before because he's in kind of a similar situation in some ways.
Well, not just Pilate, but also some of the Roman guards and centurions and stuff. I always kind of personally, even more than Pilate, because it's not up to him. He's just carrying out orders. That would be more like the person who's more like Pilate in that kind of role would be, in terms of authority anyway, would be
How?
James Cromwell's character.
Yeah.
But I always placed Paul Edgecombe. I always placed him and his men. I always put them in my head. I always cast them as the Roman centurions who are just carrying out orders, because it's not up to them. But and also, I always
what was the? I guess the centurion that maybe the centurion that John Cleese played in Life of Brian. Maybe that level.
Well, I always pictured him as the centurion who said, "Truly, this man is the son of God."
Right.
Like that, which I guess in The Greatest Story Ever Told, that was like John Wayne's line.
Yeah,
but
which he probably made half the budget of the film just for that.
Actually, though, wouldn't it be nice after the credits to just have them all together and sing "Always Look on the Bright Side of Life"?
That would have been great. Well, but I always, in my head, I always cast him in that role because it seems to fit his station in life and everything. Because Pilate, yeah, he had a lot on his mind, but he also was not a good guy by biblical standards or by historical standards. Which and I think James Cromwell's certainly better of a guy than he was. But like I
have on my mind that like it's like an Easter tradition for us to watch Jesus Christ Superstar, and he's definitely given a more sympathetic portrayal in that one. But so that's fresh in my mind.
But the scene that leads from the one you mentioned leads right into my favorite scene, and I think it's kind of the linchpin of everything, is that he's like, when I stand, when my judgment comes and I stand before God and say that I killed this miracle, what am I going to say?
One of God's miracles.
He's telling him that, he took the pain away, basically. That's what, he tells him to say. And, and that's supposed to provide him comfort, but it really doesn't. And it provides John Coffey with some comfort, but not Paul. And even though he grants his last request of being able to see a film, Top Hat, and he, I'm heaven, I'm in heaven. And one of my top 5 favorite songs of all time, by the way.
And great use of music in film.
Yes, and probably the best shot of the whole movie is where you have the flicker of the projector behind him like a halo, and it's like those are angels up there, and that whole thing that stuck with me so much when I was a kid. And they lead him to the execution room, and they do drag that out quite a lot, but it's also because it's so rich with emotion that I think it's earned. And you feel the pain of everybody on E Block who had to do this thing that they did not want to do, but it is their job. And it's like, you have to say it, you have to give the order.
And when you see David Morris's character even ball up with tears, it's like everyone's tears all at once. It's like it's such an emotional drain once you get through it all.
It really is. Like, and you could easily accuse this movie and other movies, like I'm thinking of like Dead Man Walking or something. You could easily accuse movies that kind of do that similar thing. You could accuse them of being overly sentimental or whatever. I think this movie earns every single emotional beat that it uses. Like, it earns every single moment. And so they had a right to stretch it out the way that they did, because they milk every piece of emotion from it's really astounding how good it is. Because the slightest miscalculation and that could fall on its face, but it does not. And up to and including, don't put that hood over my face because I was afraid of the dark. That whole thing, that got me when I was a kid. And so he does die, and they all resign from their posts. They work in juvenile corrections or whatever, and then we find out that Paul's curse was his blessing and his curse, which that's one of my other favorite things about the film, is that it's for every miraculous thing, it's like there are two sides to it, because John Coffey could heal, but he could also punish. He could do these extraordinary things, but it also weighed on him. And Mr. Jingles was more of Mr. Jingles, like he said, it was more of an accident that he happened to live for a long time. But again, I think Mr. Jingles is like the small microcosmic version of the macrocosmic events of the story. But like, what happens to Paul? It's the blessing and the curse, which is that he too lives for an abnormally long time. He says he's 108 years old, which is not impossible, but it is abnormally long. His blessing is that he gets to live so long, but then his curse is that he gets to live so long that he will outlive anyone that he has ever loved and ever known, and because he took away such a beautiful gift from the world. And so and that's why he says at the end that all of us are walking our own green mile every day. And so again, I love the ending because it is so bittersweet. It is yet another miracle for him to go out on, but it's also a curse because he's forced to. It's kind of like not so much the Christ allegory there, but actually more of Moses not being able to enter the promised land, that they had to wander the desert for 40 more years to allow for all the people that worship the golden calf, for them to all die off. And yet, and Moses, because of his own failings and everything, he leads his people to the promised land, but he ultimately can't go in. And so in a way, it kind of reminds me of that. It's this idea that, you are witness to and a vehicle for miracles, and yet, there's some other price to pay. So I think it communicates that very well. But I mean, that's like a very surface level analysis of this plot. There's so much more to it that we don't have time for, but and we covered characters. We covered characters.
I do want to mention, like, again, another great line in the film, and I wish I could find the exact line, and because I didn't get to finish it, it's not fresh in my mind. But, like, again, to me, this was one of the great Stephen King moments of the whole thing, in terms of, like, again, if you think of him as a horror writer, the whole thing of Mr. Jingles and Paul Edgecombe, Elaine asks him, he infected you with life? And he's like, that's as good a word as any, but there was the line after his little speech to her, and I think it was the last line in the film. You guys can tell me if I'm right or wrong, where he basically says that one thought keep me awake more than any other. And if he can make a mouse live that long, how much longer do I have? Or something like that. And that's just like, it's kind of a horrifying thought to end on. Really.
Exactly. Well, because most of us, that's what I love about this film, is that for each extraordinary thing that happens, generally there are two sides to it. That's not a simple case of, oh, that was so wonderful, or oh, that was so horrible. Like, usually for some things there are, like, what happened to Edouard Delacroix was horrible. Now, that wasn't a miracle, but like, it was horrible. And then, like, Mr. Jingles generally is portrayed as good. But like the point being that for each supernatural thing, let's say, that there's a good and a bad side to it. And, so the fact that he gets to live so long, most of us, that's what we say we want out of our lives. And yet he outlives everybody that he knows. And it's like, that would be its own punishment. And, we don't really think about, how horrifying eternal life really would be. Like eternal mortal life. I mean, not like, heaven or an altered state of being or anything like that.
A theme that we will revisit during Meet the Cast month.
Oh boy.
Already. So
but we covered off plot, we covered off characters pretty much. There's
effects.
very minimal effects in this.
But effective.
Yeah, very effective for what little there is.
Use of electricity.
Yeah, a lot of electricity. I think the only real CGI that I recall was when he coughs up the sickness or the maladies of whatever.
Some of the stuff with the mouse, because from what I understand, like I read that a lot of the times the cast were looking at laser pointers, but I think from what I understand, that wasn't so much CGI as like clever editing. But
when the mouse was resurrected and the tail started to move, I believe that was CGI.
Yeah. Well, but what's great about it though is that what little CGI there is hasn't really aged much because there's so little of it. But like, I think you're right because I saw the behind the scenes. They were shooting with a real mouse. And it looks like a real mouse, but I think you may be right as far as like they would have composited some bits together, which you could do that pretty easily. and make it look real. So that part hasn't aged at all. Now
The electric chair execution of Delacroix was
Right.
pretty
Yeah.
impressive and pretty horrifying. They did an excellent job.
Yeah, there was some
making
effect
that look
there.
extremely. Whew.
good,
I hope.
good, good,
Especially when-
They really killed him on set.
good practical effect there.
Right.
Trying to think. So they did shoot on location in bits and pieces here, but this was something I was surprised to learn. So most of the movie was shot in E Block, which was a set on the Warner Brothers backlot. But they did shoot in some parts of the South, including Blowing Rock, North Carolina, where I've been a couple times. Beautiful little mountain town, and
Nice.
good for like tourists, kind of look at the antique shops and stuff. But yeah, so mostly it was shot in that set, and but you also get to know it very well, just like you get to know these characters very well, and it has kind of its own personality, and they could have a lot more control over the lighting in a way that they could never have done with a real location.
Right. Although it is kind of sad that they filmed in North Carolina and Tennessee when it's supposed to be set in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Because that's not the same.
No,
I think
but
it would be
it's
cheap to film in Louisiana with all the.
well nowadays. Yeah, I don't know what it was like then, but at the very least, it's in the same geographic region as opposed to like if they'd have shot in Bulgaria or someplace.
Right.
Which they easily could have done.
Yes, Canada wouldn't have worked so well.
Well, I was thinking Bulgaria because I was thinking like that's what later period Roger Corman would do is go to Bulgaria,
right.
just because you could save a whole lot of money doing that.
Right.
But
if we want to talk about the other production aspects, I think overall the production design, the look of the film was quite excellent.
Very, very consistent all the way through.
Right.
Everything
nice
worked in
music.
concert.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, music. Thomas Newman, excellent score.
Yes, he's
quite a good.
I thought whatever.
Did he finally win? I think he finally won.
That was in the same year as American Beauty.
Well, he was nominated for American Beauty, but he was.
Well, he won for Skyfall's score.
He has not won yet. 15 nominations. 15 nominations. He has not won.
Oh, because wasn't that Michael Dana or whatever for Life of Pi that Skyfall was nominated that year?
Yeah, I don't recall, but yeah. So he has been nominated for Shawshank Redemption, Little Women, Unstrung Heroes, American Beauty, Road to Perdition, Finding Nemo, A Series of Unfortunate Events, The Good German, WALL-E, Skyfall, Saving Mr. Banks, Bridge of Spies, Passengers, 1917, and an original song nomination for WALL-E. Has not won. There's something wrong with that.
Unreal. Absolutely unreal.
Well, apparently the Georgia Pines nursing home was used for which was apparently in Moses Cone National Park in Blowing Rock, North Carolina.
Yeah.
So that's kind of cool for your aspect of things, Dan.
Yeah, and I've been to Blowing Rock a couple times. It's a nice little sleepy town.
Where is that exactly?
Yeah, but
I guess
you need to figure that out.
The prison that was used was Tennessee State Penitentiary in Nashville, Tennessee.
Yeah. So we covered score, covered the effects, all that stuff. What about favorite scenes, everyone?
Favorite scenes.
Well, I already said mine, which was if I stand before God, what am I going to say? That whole bit, that's mine.
So Blowing Rock is just south of Boone, huh?
Yep. And Boone is where Boone is where Appalachian State is, where that was one of the schools I was looking at going to, but I got into my first choice school.
I looked at Laverne Ryan.
I would probably say the top. I would say the top hat scene when Coffee is seeing Top Hat.
That's beautiful.
Yep.
Certainly, in
I have
terms of just pure visuals, I'd say that definitely tops the list.
I have several, but one of the small moments that I enjoy is directly after Paul Edgecombe has his night with his wife. He comes back and shares some cornbread bread with John Coffey, and he has to
was your Mrs. pleased several times
because he doesn't quite get it right away why he's given him the cornbread bread. So the fact that he had to explain, well, my wife was pleasured several times.
Right.
So I enjoy that moment. I don't know why, but when Edward Delacroix is being cooked so far, while Bill is in the background going like,
Right.
he's really cooking, you know.
Yeah.
I guess I enjoy his fanatics a little bit.
Well, it's funny because this movie was generally well liked by critics and the public, and it did get a decent amount of Oscar nominations. But there were some detractors of the film who thought that it was a bit melodramatic. I personally, melodrama as a genre, which it is a genre, it does tend to get, a bad rap, even though, just like any genre, it can be done well. No, I don't think so. No. I think a good example of like a melodrama, I think, would be something like Titanic. Basically it's the idea that the drama is heightened or is on a larger scale. I think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest was pretty small scale and more down to earth in terms of its drama. This was heightened by the simple fact that it was a fantasy drama. And also because it has like some things that are meant to heighten the drama even beyond that. Like, it's a thunderstorm with Edouard Delacroix's horrific execution, and he can somehow feel that, he's frying now. And, John Coffey can actually feel him. And so all of that is definitely heightened in a classical melodrama sense. But my point in saying all that is that melodrama does get a bad rap, but I think that there are plenty of examples of it being done well, this being one of them. Now, I think that this is more, I'd say, a drama that is punctuated by some moments of melodrama, but again, that doesn't mean that melodrama cannot be done well. And I think this one, when it is melodramatic, it does it very well. So.
And I guess I also enjoy the Percy Wetmore's Mouse Hunt. His whole exasperated.
Well, and this was 2 years.
Find the mouse, and he's so.
Go ahead.
When he's so disappointed, mouse.
I thought it was funny that this came out 2 years after the movie Mouse Hunt, which I remembered growing up with when I was a kid, which was about the fanatical search for an abnormally intelligent mouse.
And a very cunning mouse.
Yeah,
that's what
we should talk about that movie sometime.
That's what Mr. Jingles did for a while, but then he decided after he retired to come back and stay with Tom Hanks. So that was
maybe the mouse in Mouse Hunt, maybe he's related to Mr. Jingles, because technically Mr. Jingles would be his elder.
Right.
That's true. A mouse like that living that long would have a lot of children.
Oh, for sure.
and not the clown movie that Brandon loves so much.
Well, I did notice some of those similarities, but obviously this has a lot more going on. But yeah, because similar to Mouse Hunt, this little mouse causes a lot of heartache for certain people until they learn to use his gifts instead of to try to kill him.
Use them for good instead of for evil.
Yeah, the Mouse Hunt mouse was set more for evil, but not quite. He was more of like a force of nature.
Right. I guess we probably continue on with the favorites. Did you finish yours, Dave? I guess.
Yeah.
Maybe.
Okay.
Okay.
I
Yeah.
told all.
Okay.
Brandon.
Brandon,
So
you were saying
I
something?
actually I had a couple of them with the movie. I like all of the little moments. That would probably be
Mm-hmm.
the best thing to say. The little moments where we learned about the characters with them just interacting, joking with each other, and becoming. Well, apparently it's a very boring set of moments, evidently.
I guess.
But I don't consider them boring or enough to put one to think that this is one of those where I do think that we learn about the
Mhm.
characters. So I appreciate those a lot.
Right.
And because of that, it like I said, that's why I'm conflicted about it because it is so well done.
Hmm. I'm going to largely agree with that. There's a lot of little moments. It's really hard to pick favorites out of the bunch. Like, I agree with Forrest that Coffee watching the movie was a great moment, and the reaction at the beginning that Edgecombe had to the movie was a great moment. Um, there are other little moments here and there. We've mentioned a lot of them. That the line about the cheese sliding off the cracker is just a classic line. The line at the end, Edgecombe says about how much longer do I have is just a great line. But one line that I wanted to make sure I mentioned that I've forgotten, and unfortunately it's not listed in the quotes, so I may get it slightly wrong. But that's the part where they have Toot running the trial run for Bitterbuck's execution,
Yeah.
and he's running
yeah.
off at the mouth and saying all this stuff. And when they're strapping him into the chair, this one of my favorite lines in the movie is like he says something to the effect of, "Oh, and I'm so sorry, and I promise never to do it again." That's for sure.
Yeah. I love that. And then one of my other favorite funny lines was with Wild Bill is like, "This son of a bitch pissed on me," and then he's like, "Piss on me," and he turns on the fire
Right.
hose.
Or actually, speaking of that particular phenomenon, one that I did kind of like, where Delacroix for once got a little bit of a chance to fight back at Percy, and that was after Bill humiliated him and he pissed himself.
Yeah.
And Delacroix was like, "Webmore, good name for you." It's like,
You know what I just realized? There's a lot of piss in this movie. There's Wild Bill pisses on the one guy. You got Percy pisses himself. Paul's got a urinary tract infection. There's piss all over the
actually,
place.
that's another moment. That's another moment I
We're
want to
trying
make sure
to.
gets mentioned. The sheer look of joy on Tom Hanks' face
Yes.
after he is healed.
The meme worthy face that he makes.
After he imitated Adam Sandler's longest piss.
But he did it much more convincingly than Sandler ever could.
Yeah.
Ogre did it better.
But I mean, I'm with you though. It's really hard to pick because like there's so many great ones. The other one that if I had to pick a number two, at least as far as dialogue, because I'm with Forrest as far as in the visual realm and everything. That whole scene is the most visually striking out of all of them. I think in terms of a line that sticks with me, probably this number two that sticks with me is with Delacroix right before he gets led to his horrific execution. But he's like, "I wish I could have met you guys someplace else." Like that whole thing. Oh, that got me.
Even though, from what I remember from the book, he really was a piece of work before he went to death row. But he took his time and actually became a pretty decent, likable fella. He was repentant, but and the same thing with Bitterbuck. The two of them were repentant for their previous. They were not innocents by any stretch.
No.
But they
Well, they prove that you could have done horrible things, but it didn't necessarily make you an irredeemable person.
Right.
Which is a very mature attitude to have.
Well, and
but
at
I mean,
time, the prisons did not have the kind of programs to entirely like turn a person around from being on death for their crimes.
Which I mean,
people have-
you don't really have those for death row even now, but you know,
No.
you're right that those programs didn't really exist. I mean, even today they exist very sparingly, and I mean that's a whole other discussion about how like with privatized prisons, how they're incentivized to fill those cells and everything. But yeah, they're not in the business of preventing recidivism. They want those cells to be filled. But
Did we talk about the music behind
yeah,
it?
Yeah, we did.
Yes, we
We
did.
I
did.
think
Yes.
we pretty much hit most of it.
I
yeah.
think we
Well,
got most of it.
I
so
just
yeah.
feel bad because again, this is a over 3 hour film that it's like we have to take a relatively surface level glance at it because it does yield a lot deeper of a dive, but obviously we don't have time for that. But I think we covered off the big chunks.
All
Yep.
right. Well, tonight, ladies and gentlemen, we have some more in store for you. Another film with Tom Hanks. So stay tuned for that. As we definitely do a dive into another aspect of horror, war. So,
Yeah, Saving Private Ryan, and also with Barry Pepper, and it came out the year before this film.
And actually, weird thing. I don't know if any of y'all noticed. Currently, Saving Private Ryan is number 26 on the Internet Movie Database, and The Green Mile is number 27.
Well, is Shawshank still number one?
Yeah, probably
Another
always will be.
Frank Darabont, Stephen King prison
Right.
film.
alrighty, ladies. So join us on our channel on Inside Movies Galore so you can hear more. So thank you for listening. Have a great day, evening, and morning. And Dead Man Walking here. Dead Man Walking.
Walking.
Right.
So who's